They murdered her husband, then asked her to marry the killer. She smiled and buried them alive. This is the true story of Olga of Kyiv, the queen who burned her enemies and still became a saint. Have you ever had one of those weeks where everything seems to go wrong, and all you can do is sit back, sip your tea, and plan your imaginary revenge on whoever left the milk out again? Now, imagine if you were a 10th century Slavic queen, widowed, insulted, and left in charge of a growing empire. And instead of dreaming up a witty comeback or a cold shoulder, you devised a revenge so theatrical, so fiery, that even medieval warlords raised their eyebrows. This is the story of Olga of Kyiv. She was no one's idea of a warm and cozy grandmother, and yet history remembers her not just for her cruelty, but for her cunning. And oddly enough, she may be one of the few people to have burned hundreds of men alive and still ended up canonized as a saint. Quite the resume, isn't it? Let's set the scene. We're in Eastern Europe around the year 945. Olga is the queen, consort of Kyiv, a powerful and growing state that would one day become modern Ukraine. Her husband Igor is the ruling prince. Life is not easy. This is a time of thick forests, wooden fortresses, tribal wars, and long cold winters where the only thing fiercer than the wolves outside might be the people inside. Igor, like many rulers of his time, made the unfortunate decision to overtax a neighboring tribe known as the Drevlians. Now you'd think a ruler might have some tact when squeezing his neighbors for money. Not Igor. He decided to go back for a second helping, twice in one season. The Drevlians didn't appreciate being treated like a piggy bank, so they killed him. Not in battle, mind you. No glorious sword fight or ambush in the snow. They tied him between two bent birch trees and let the trees snap back. Think of it like medieval bungee jumping, but without the bungee or any hope of survival. Olga was now a widow, and the Drevlians, bold as ever, thought this was a perfect moment to seize control. So what did they do? They sent 20 of their best men to Kyiv with a message: "Marry our Prince Mal and all will be forgiven." This was, to put it mildly, a mistake. Olga welcomed them with grace and honor. She nodded politely, smiled just enough to be polite but not too much, and promised to consider their generous offer. Then she had them buried alive. Not metaphorically, literally. She had her servants dig a massive trench and invited the envoys to step into it for a quick, private audience. Once they were in, she gave the signal. Dirt rained down. The Drevlians had brought their best negotiators, and now they were part of the palace landscaping. Now, most people might stop there. One good act of vengeance, and you could call it a day. Not Olga. She sent a message back to the Drevlians. "Your offer is interesting, but I'd like to meet more of your nobles. Why not send your most distinguished elders to escort me?" Surprisingly, the Drevlians agreed. They sent their wisest men, their most eloquent leaders, the kind who probably started sentences with, "in my experience," and ended them with, "and that's how you build a functioning alliance." Olga had them all burned alive. They were invited to bathe upon their arrival, offered the luxury of the royal bathhouse. A kindness, they thought. Maybe this widow isn't so bad after all. While they were steaming and scrubbing, Olga locked the doors and set the place ablaze. At this point, it's hard not to admire her consistency. She wasn't just taking revenge, she was staging it like opera. Each act more dramatic, more merciless than the last, and she still wasn't done. She prepared for an outright siege of the Drevlian capital. Her army marched in, crushed the resistance, and cornered the remaining survivors in their wooden fortress. Olga could have ended it there with swords and fire, but instead she paused and made them an offer. She was tired, she said. Bloodshed had gone far enough. All she wanted now was a simple tribute, 3 pigeons and 3 sparrows from each household. The Drevlians were confused, but relieved. What kind of war ends with birds? They gathered the tribute, thinking themselves lucky to have survived. That night, Olga's soldiers tied pieces of burning sulfur to the legs of each bird and released them. The birds flew home straight to the wooden rooftops of Drevlian homes, and as they landed, the fires spread. In minutes, the entire town was engulfed. No swords, no siege towers, just smoke, feathers, and a queen whose wrath would echo across centuries. There's something surreal about this whole tale, isn't there? Olga didn't raise her voice. She didn't swing a sword. She simply outwitted every man who underestimated her, and did it all while maintaining an air of cold dignity. But before we get swept away by the spectacle of it all, there's a strange peace in remembering why stories like this matter. They remind us how even the most overlooked figures in history, especially women pushed to the margins, found a way to leave their mark. Sometimes that mark just happens to be fire. Let's continue, shall we? Now, if you're thinking, surely this is where the curtain falls on Olga's story, you'd be forgiven. Most tales of medieval revenge peak with a scorched city and a queen standing in the smouldering ruins, her eyes reflecting firelight. But Olga of Kyiv wasn't just out for vengeance. She had something much more ambitious in mind. She was going to rule. Here's the thing. Ruling a medieval kingdom wasn't exactly a retirement plan. It wasn't peaceful or ceremonial. It was grit, diplomacy, power plays, and the constant threat of being overthrown by your cousin twice removed. For a woman, it was 10 times harder. Women were rarely trusted with power unless it was temporary, and even then everyone was waiting for a man to come fix things. But Olga, she didn't wait. She didn't ask. She didn't blink. With her son, young Sviatoslav still a child, Olga stepped into the role of regent. That meant she would officially rule on his behalf until he came of age. But in truth, she ruled for herself. And she did it so effectively that the state of Kyiv not only survived, it flourished. It's fascinating to imagine what that would have looked like in the 10th century. Olga, wrapped in fur and linen, riding out to inspect distant towns, holding court in cold stone halls, lit by flickering torches with nobles leaning forward, hanging on her every word. She wasn't a figurehead. She made real decisions. She reorganized tribute systems, established administrative districts, and reformed the taxation process so efficiently that future rulers kept her model for years. Now let's pause and think about that. This is a woman who just a short time ago was overseeing mass cremations and orchestrating pigeon-based arson. And now she's streamlining bureaucracy? Yes, and remarkably well too. Olga was one of the first in Eastern Europe to introduce a kind of regional government. Her appointed officials, called pogosti, would travel from town to town, collecting tribute and resolving disputes. Instead of relying on brute force, she created a system. In other words, she made the government less about swords and more about scrolls. It was, in many ways, ahead of its time. But while Olga was sharpening Kyiv's internal structure, she had her eye on something even larger than taxes or revenge. She had begun to think about faith, and this is where things take a surprising turn. Because when we talk about saints, those serene faces in golden halos, we usually don't expect to find them buried in the fine print of medieval war stories. And yet, that's exactly where Olga was heading. Somewhere in her travels, or perhaps in the quiet after all the fire had gone out, Olga began to feel drawn to the Christian faith. At that point in history, much of the Slavic world still followed traditional pagan beliefs. Worship of the sun, moon, and nature spirits was common. But Olga, she leaned towards something new. So what does she do? She makes a diplomatic journey to Constantinople, one of the most powerful and glittering cities in the world. A city of golden domes and ancient secrets, ruled by the Byzantine emperor himself. It's said that Emperor Constantine VII, clever and smooth as a greased weasel, was so impressed with Olga's intelligence and poise that he proposed marriage. And here, once again, we get a glimpse of Olga's signature style. She accepted his offer, but only if he would first baptize her. Now, to understand just how savvy this move was, let's break it down. Baptism was a big deal. By accepting Christianity, Olga would not only gain religious legitimacy, she'd also gain powerful allies in the Christian world. It was like joining an elite political club, and by having the emperor himself baptize her, she elevated her own status dramatically. But then came the twist. Once baptized, Olga reminded Constantine of his new role as her godfather, which of course made marriage between them spiritually impossible. Checkmate. The emperor laughed, or at least he's reported to have laughed. Whether it was out of amusement or sheer frustration, we'll never know, but he respected her all the more for it. Olga had traveled to the heart of the empire, adopted a new faith, rejected a proposal with wit and grace, and returned to Kyiv stronger than ever. Back home, though, not everyone was on board. Christianity was still seen as foreign, soft, even dangerous. Olga tried to convince her son Sviatoslav to convert, but he refused. He preferred the old gods, the traditions, the warrior spirit. "If my men hear that I have become a Christian," he said, "they will laugh at me." And there it is, that deeply human moment between generations. A mother trying to pass down what she believes is wisdom, only to be met with stubbornness. We've all felt that, haven't we? You guide, you nurture, and then they choose their own path. It's timeless. But Olga didn't force him. She ruled beside him until he came of age, and then she stepped back. Not with resentment, but with dignity. Her legacy wasn't just about fire and vengeance anymore. It was about structure, order, faith, and something rare for rulers of her time, restraint. She lived long enough to see her grandson, Vladimir, eventually embrace Christianity and spread it throughout the Kievan Rus. It was her seed that took root long after the fires burned out. So yes, Olga of Kyiv may be remembered as the queen who burned her enemies alive, but perhaps she should also be remembered as the one who laid the foundation for an empire's soul. And if there's something comforting in that, maybe it's the reminder that even the fiercest chapters of our lives don't have to define our whole story. Let's take a moment to just breathe in the absurdity and majesty of Olga's life. She began her reign surrounded by treachery and bloodshed, left a widow by brutal murder, and answered with one of the most poetic and terrifying acts of Isais, revenge in medieval history. Then, just as quickly as the flames of her fury rose, she shifted focus entirely, built a functioning state, negotiated with emperors, converted to a new religion, and somehow, through it all, kept her crown on straight. If you're wondering how someone pulls off a life like that without cracking, I'll let you in on a little secret. Olga didn't try to be liked. She tried to be respected. In an age where rulers were often little more than sword-swinging land hoarders, Olga distinguished herself not just with violence, plenty of that to go around, but with vision. She saw beyond the next battle. Beyond the next tribute, she saw a future, and it's that ability to see further than others that gives her story so much weight. You see, after her death around the year 969, things didn't exactly quiet down. Her son Sviatoslav, the proud pagan warrior, spent much of his rule fighting off enemies on every side. He was brave, no doubt, but his style was more firebrand than founder. Without the organizational work of his mother, Sviatoslav's victories might have turned to dust. It's hard to hold an empire together with just a sword, but thanks to Olga there was a system. There were towns that knew how to pay taxes without needing to be threatened. There were borders that made sense, roads that could move armies, and goods. Her invisible hand kept things stitched together even when everything else started to fray. Now let's talk about the strange irony at the heart of her story. Olga, as you already know, was canonized as a saint in the Eastern Orthodox Church, but not because she was especially gentle, not because she spent her life healing the sick or feeding the poor. No, we don't see that version of sainthood here. She was canonized because she was the first Christian in her royal line, because she brought the faith home with her and tried sincerely to share it with her people, and it worked, just not right away. Her grandson, Vladimir, the one who, like her, ruled with both fire and charm, eventually made Christianity the official religion of Kievan Rus. And when he did, it wasn't a new movement. It was a continuation of what Olga had started. That's the mark of real legacy, isn't it? Not what happens while you're alive, but what keeps moving after you're gone. It's the same for all of us, really. You don't always get to see the harvest of the seeds you plant. Maybe you mentor someone, offer a kindness, build something with care, and then, years later, someone else benefits, sometimes without even knowing your name. Olga planted those seeds with iron hands and a mind like a steel trap. Her faith wasn't just personal, it was strategic. She knew aligning Kyiv with Christian Europe would open doors, not just heavenly ones, but political and economic ones. Too, of course, she never lived to see how big that door would open, but her grandson did. And when the priests and scribes of his day looked for someone to credit, someone to honor, they looked back to the woman who had once set birds on fire, to conquer a city, and somehow found God in the aftermath. Now you might be asking, how do you reconcile the contradictions of her life? On the one hand, burning bathhouses. On the other, diplomacy and sainthood. Can one person really hold all those identities at once? Yes. Because history, real history, is messy. And human beings aren't tidy little archetypes. We're complicated. We grieve, we rage, we build, we forgive. We make colossal mistakes and still manage to carve meaning from them. Olga is not an example of perfection. She's an example of transformation. And that's why she resonates even now, over 1,000 years later. Maybe that's also why we're drawn to stories like hers, especially as we get older, because we know what it means to wear many faces over a lifetime. The younger version of us would barely recognize the person we've become. And yet both are equally true, equally us. It's comforting, isn't it, to know that even a fearsome medieval queen could evolve, that even a woman known for her vengeance could become the backbone of a nation's faith, that people can begin in fire and end in peace. And maybe that's a lesson we carry with us today, that we're all allowed to change, that no matter how dramatic or difficult the first chapters of our story may be, the ending can still be gentle, uplifting, sacred. You just have to keep turning the pages. If you've made it this far, you've likely realized this isn't just a story about fire and fury. It's about a woman who held the reins of history in her hands and squeezed hard enough to leave fingerprints across centuries. But of course, every story, no matter how extraordinary, must eventually come to an end. And so we arrive at the twilight of Olga's life. She died around the year 969, likely in her 70s, which, by medieval standards, was nothing short of remarkable. This was a time when living past 40 meant you'd probably outlived most of your neighbors, your enemies, and several rounds of plague. Olga's long life was more than luck. It was a combination of clever politics, spiritual resilience, and perhaps the sort of iron will that keeps even death a little nervous. And when she died, she was buried with all the solemnity due to a ruler. But not just any ruler, a Christian ruler. That detail matters, because for a long time Olga had been something of an anomaly in her court. She had embraced a faith that many still viewed as foreign, weak, even laughable, and yet she stood firm in it until the end. When her time came, she left instructions to be buried according to Christian rites, no pagan rituals, no animal sacrifices, no fire, oddly enough, just peace. And in that moment, the queen who once commanded the skies to rain burning birds became something far more mysterious, a symbol. Her tomb became a quiet battleground of legacy. For some, she was the wise and holy grandmother of Eastern orthodoxy in the Slavic world. For others, she remained the warrior widow who had torched a city without lifting a sword, and both were true. Which brings us to perhaps the most fascinating part of Olga's story, not the bloodshed, not the religion, not even the revenge. It's how she's remembered. See, most rulers fade with time. They get reduced to statues, footnotes, and blurry family trees. But Olga, she evolved. In Orthodox Christianity, she became Saint Olga, equal to the apostles. That's not a title handed out lightly. It's reserved for people who played a pivotal role in spreading the faith, people who changed the course of religious history, and she did it without a crusade, without a miracle, without even a martyr's end. She did it with intellect, and maybe that's the part that sticks with us most as we reflect on her legacy. Olga used the tools she had, her mind, her will, her sheer ability to stay one step ahead. Her vengeance may have made headlines in the 10th century, but her vision is what truly stood the test of time. Now here's something to think about. In our own lives, we may never face armies or emperors. We may never be canonized or feared. But each of us holds power, the power to endure, to forgive, to rebuild, to surprise everyone who thought they had us figured out. Olga reminds us that change doesn't come all at once. It arrives in stages, in layers. You start by surviving. Then you plan, then you act, then you rise. And maybe that's what real strength looks like. Not the loud kind, not the kind that burns everything down, but the kind that outlasts the storm, the kind that lets you walk into a room and command respect without ever raising your voice. And yes, even the kind that makes emperors propose to you, only to outmaneuver them with a smile. So the next time you feel underestimated or overlooked, or simply tired of the chaos around you, remember Olga, not for the flames she lit, but for the future she shaped, for the faith she carried, for the way she turned her own sorrow into something lasting, something bigger than herself. That's a story worth telling. And now that we've told it, maybe you feel a little different too. Not just entertained, but in some quiet way empowered. Because if a widowed queen in 10th century Kyiv can burn her enemies alive, reorganize an empire, convert to a faith no one wanted, and still walk away with sainthood, well, you can probably handle that grocery store clerk who gave you the wrong change. Thank you for joining me on this journey through Olga's story. If it left you thinking, smiling, or simply feeling a little more curious about history, then I'd say we did our job. If you'd like more cozy, compelling stories from the past to relax with, go ahead and like this video and subscribe. Share your thoughts below. Was Olga a hero, a villain, or something far more complicated? Until next time, stay curious, stay kind, and remember, some of the most powerful stories come from the most unexpected lives.